So we'll go just one or two more minutes and then we'll get started. Thank you all for your patience as we work out our little bit of logistics. There's always a fun time when you do this for the first time with a series. And this is our first, as I mentioned in some of the emails to you all. We're doing this every month on a variety of different topics. So as you go through this workshop and as you think about other topics that you would like to see covered in the workshop, please don't hesitate to let me know. And you can reach me at jmancini77@gmail, and just send me a note, anything, any people or any topics you'd like to see covered. We'd be happy to do it. So with that, why don't we get started here? And I will make sure all my buttons are in place. I think all my buttons are in place. And welcome. It's really a pleasure to have you all with us today. We're really pleased to launch this with actually one of my favorite speakers in the records management space, which is Lisa Haralampus. And she'll be focusing on, what's life like after M1921, M2307, whatever you want to call it. What's NARA up to in 2023? And so, again, a reminder, this is part of a series. This is some of the upcoming sessions that we have. Paul Van Reed from EPA will talk about understanding digitization at scale. Then we'll be really pleased. Hopefully, Lisa will talk about this in a little bit, about the time that all the federal digitization standards are out there and people starting to think about what they mean. Jeff Reed and Kevin DeVorsey are very, very knowledgeable about this. That'll be a really cool session. Katie Perry, who has a lot of experience in the NIH space and the federal government space, will be talking about managing particularly electronic records and what that means. And then Jesse Wilkins, who I think many of you know from ARMA circles and AIM circles. And I like to think of Jesse as a lovable curmudgeon in the space. We'll talk about some of the mistakes and challenges that people make within the whole records management area. Feel free to post questions. If we don't get to them today, you'll see a little question button. And I've noticed already that some people have started to use it. If we don't get to them today, we'll get back to you. You'll notice in Lisa's presentation that there are hot links. We'll send you the original presentation with those hot links, so you can take a look at that. We'll also send you a recording of the session. And so if you have anybody else in your organization that would be interested, just feel free to send them the link, and we'd be happy to share it and encourage them to attend for the future sessions. This is being sponsored by QAI, Quality Associates Incorporated, and by DocPoint Solutions. And just in case you don't know who those folks are, QAI offers a full range of document scanning and imaging products and services, including hardware, software, integration services, and training. The way I like to think about QAI is that they manage a network of multiple vendors. And so, rather than dealing with a particular vendor only, QAI's emphasis is on the integration of those products into an effective solution. DocPoint Solutions has some overlapping competencies, but particularly is focused on the M365 and SharePoint environment. And so again, if you have any questions or if there's something you want to discuss privately, don't hesitate to reach out at the contact information there. You can also send me an email at jmancini77. So we're going to try something radical. I'm always a little reluctant to move away from just pure presentation, but we'd like to get a feel for where folks are in their records management journey. So let's have our first question of trying to think through something that might be a little bit unusual. Where are you? Whoops, I got to do this. Push this button, relaunch poll. And I'm hoping that you all are seeing a quick poll in terms of where are you in your records modernization journey? And I just want to get a feel for what the audience is like. That'll help us structure future sessions along the lines in terms of like, where do we steer this thing moving forward? If you're a solution provider or if you're a consultant, if you could just check off that bottom one. I'm really interested particularly at where end users are in their journey. And I'll share the results in just a second once we get a few more people chiming in. We're going to have another poll a little bit later on with regards to NARA priorities moving forward. So I guess I should have some of that Jeopardy music in the background while people take the poll. So let's give it just another second. Still see a couple of folks coming in. And this is pretty interesting. And Lisa and Scott, when you get into your sections of this, this might be something that you want to you might want to comment on a little bit. You can see where folks are, which even though there's there's a significant focus on the federal government in this session, this is not that unusual. You know, lots of times people think that the private sector is enormously more further down the curve than the public sector. My experience is that it's not at all the case, that most everybody is in that, you know, kind of 2 or 3 aspect. Very few have a fully implemented strategy. And so we'll be touching on that during the course of our time here together. So let me just hand over the reins to my good friend, Lisa Haralampus. Lisa, I'll let you do the self-introduction because I always hate it when people, you know, read that big long thing that just, you know, goes on and on forever of like, you know, where you were confirmed and what high school you went to and what graduate school you went to and all that kind of good stuff. So let me turn it over to you. As I mentioned earlier, I'm biased, but you're one of my most fun and creative people in the record space, and so I'm really pleased to have you here today. So, pshaw. Okay, take it over. Take it over, Lisa.
Well, thank you very much, John. I appreciate that. I have received feedback over the course of my 30-year federal career that, wow, you really get excited. You care about federal records management. Well, of course, it's one of the most interesting topics out there. For a high level, I'll just say all I'm trying to do is help the National Archives and the federal government en masse in total identify all records and information that was ever created and then proactively make decisions on what to do with it. So with that being the uber problem statement of what records management's about, it's been a wonderful career and I'm really excited to be here talking today. So we'll go to the next slide. That introduces who I am a little bit more. So for those of you who don't know, I always like to say there's always somebody new in the audience who's learning for the first time. I work at the National Archives and Records Administration. And I sometimes joke, I work in and records administration. So not as much part of the National Archives, but the part of the organization that helps work with agencies to do, as I said on this slide, I'm in the office of the Chief Records Officer for the US government. We do policy, training, oversight on appraisal and scheduling too. Those are the 4 pillars that help our office solve that uber problem of identifying all records and proactively making decisions about their management. So I work in policy. I am the Director of Policy and Outreach. So I am very lucky for this presentation today that John invited me to come speak about. What I want to focus on is where I sit in NARA, sort of looking out at what policy needs to be written and share that with you today, talking about different areas of focus and how it relates to our mission of managing federal records. And as you can see on this slide, I will highlight that while our mission is to help federal government manage its records as a business asset, underlying everything we say is this idea that records are integral to doing an agency mission. You need to know what you said and document what you did. That's how the federal government, that's part of what records management is so interesting. And when you do that well, our goal is to have the records management done so that it happens automatically behind the scenes. Our goal for, I think, NARA's policy and the direction we've been pushing is to see the leveraging the technology that's been developing to do better records management across the board, automated behind the scenes, take it out of user discussions and put it in the hands of information professional discussions. And we do that with a small staff. We have about 80 plus people. We're spread throughout the country. And you're looking at a beautiful picture of Archives 2, which is our headquarters. So that's where I would be if I were not teleworking right now in my telework location. So next slide. So the main guidance product that has been driving our vision, our need, we have been working on this for several years, is the OMB and NARA guidance. We worked together to issue guidance directing agencies to transition to electronic records. That is the name of our bulletin that went out under OMB's auspices. Its number was M1921, so it was the 21st bulletin issued in fiscal year 19. And it was called Transition to Electronic Records. And that guidance was a continuation of several other NARA OMB memos where we have been striving and pushing the government towards electronic records management. First, we focused on email. Then we focused on permanent electronic records. And then in 2019, it was let's focus on all records and really make this push to move to electronic record keeping. The 2019 memo had a due date, and that due date was December 30th, 2023. With COVID, with disruptions to agencies' plans, making it difficult to send records, to ship them to federal record centers, to move to commercial record centers, there were some key pieces of goals and deadlines that were very difficult to do during COVID. So OMB and NARA, they updated that guidance. So we have a new memo, the 7th memo of fiscal year came out in December, that is an update to the transition. So when you talk about NARA guidance, it's important. I know it's like, well, what's in effect? M1921 or M2307? Yes, they are both in effect because M19 laid out a series of goals and targets that sort of describe what needs to be done. And M2307 extends the deadline, reaffirms the goals, added a few more things for NARA to do. So with that guidance in place, it's important to know we have extended the deadlines to June 30th, 24. And the overarching goal of both memos is to encourage agencies to transition and manage records electronically. We think it is a more effective, more efficient, it's better at providing access, it's better at providing information to make decisions. So we have a host of reasons why we talk about the importance of transitioning to electronic records. And we have these targets and goals to get there. I'll also highlight that in classic policy writing, we listed our goals and said they needed to be met to the fullest extent possible. If agencies needed more time or they had some major barrier to making that transition by that date, like a statutory requirement, a statutory or legal requirement, or there was a cost benefit issue about it, we have guidance in a NARA bulletin that our agency wrote that explains how agencies can request exceptions. However, as John's poll indicated, and one of my slides later on is going to indicate, we've been, agencies have been reporting that they're moving on that direction. And we've had no more than about 20 or so exception requests at this time, which again, usually are big structural requests, not like I need help with one box. John, I'll point out that one person said they couldn't see the slide. So if there's the technical thing, I'll highlight that for you. And we'll go to the next slide that person unfortunately cannot see. So where is NARA heading? We knew this, the goals are not new. We've been working on them for many years. We have a couple of different focus areas. We've been developing policy and guidance and training and doing appraisal related to these areas. The main focus area that NARA is issuing and working on right now is digitization guidance. So, because you're going to transition to electronic records, that can mean looking at the records you have in an analog or paper format and scanning them and digitizing them. So you can now use them in your electronic records management systems, have a full collection, take information that was on a shelf and put it on in the cloud. Now it's accessible and usable and easier to do disposition on as in that environment. So I'd like to point out, because this is coming, I want to make it, this is my digitization spiel. In 2019, we issued guidance on how to digitize temporary records. And again, for that one person who's brand new here today, I need to say, when I say temporary records, I mean records that never come to the National Archives. Whenever they were born, created, or managed, at some point, those federal records are destroyed or deleted. If you have permanent records, why those records get to go to, I call it records heaven, us at the National Archives. They get to come and stay in our collections as part of the U.S. National Archives to be managed for as long as the archives is able to do so. In other words, we rarely deaccession records. I mean, it can happen, but on the whole, they're our nation's treasures. When permanent records come to us, we are literally making history and saving history on behalf of the American people. So there is a very, very small set of records that come to us as permanent. And how we're going to digitize permanent records is different than the standards we issue for digitizing temporary records. So when these slides are shared, or if you're searching right now and doing a little proactive listening and looking, we keep our digitization standards. They're issued in regulations, and our NARA's regulations are in Chapter 36 CFR Chapter 12, Section 36, Subpart D. So you have a very nice set of standards that are at a very high level. We basically told agencies, as long as you can digitize those records so that the digitized versions can serve the same purpose as the originals, you're meeting those standards. Make sure they're complete, comprehensive. You've selected the right information and you've done a validation. You can never digitize without double checking what you've digitized. But at a high level, that's what we say for temporary records. Well, I am really excited. John has the wonderful timing of this guidance. We are expecting to issue our permanent digitization standards in regulations, I'm saying, the next 2 to 4 weeks. They are currently, this is brand new news from yesterday, those regulations, that rulemaking package is with the Office of the Federal Register. So it is out of NARA. It's, well, technically not out of NARA. NARA runs the Federal Register, but it is out of NARA as a creator of regulations and over to NARA as the people who run the Federal Register. So the publication of those standards is going to happen very, very soon. Take that with a grain of salt, because every time I've made a prediction about these standards and regulations over the past 3 years, I've been wrong. But hey, I've got to get right at some point. So please be on the lookout for that. You'll hear about that. I have a slide later on how to follow us and connect with us. We will definitely be communicating when we are able to issue those digitization standards. We have had a lot of questions about digitization guidance. I'm not able to go into that today here. This is an overview of our focus areas and what we're talking about. But if you do have questions about digitization, please feel free to chat them in the slide. I know we're going to have a nice long Q&A, or chat them in the box. We'll look forward to talking about them more. Happy to do so. Next slide, John. So one area that we were focusing on was digitization, because that's a key part of being able to take what we've used in the past and transition it to electronic. Another area of focus for the National Archives that you've seen recently is electronic messaging. So I mentioned just briefly a few minutes ago that when we started with our guidance and the transition, our first area that we focused on was email. All agencies had email. It was difficult to manage with traditional records management practices, which means really you wanted me to click and file my email, make record determination for every message that comes across my desk every minute of the day. No, that's not our vision. We want records management to be automated, behind the scenes, and done and managed according to information governance rules. So we created some approaches to managing email, including our capstone approach. The capstone approach says you basically look at the roles and positions in your organization, and based on that role and position, you create a retention period. For most federal employees, that retention period is 7 years if you're using our general record schedule. For some federal employees, and that is a very small group, again, who may be creating those permanent records, that part of history that needs to come to NARA, we would make those emails permanent. So the individuals no longer had to think, is this a record email? Is this not a record email? We said, you know what? We'll take all your email and we will manage that as a collection over time. You can send them to us when they're 15 years old at the earliest. So that was the approach for email. We have recently, and here's the slides where you can see the date and the information about it. We have recently expanded that capstone approach, not just for email, but e-messages. Because technology keeps advancing, we keep watching how things change. I literally remember being in meetings 30 years ago, hearing nobody will ever use email for business. And I think I remember being in meetings 10 years ago, being, really, you think people are gonna like text important decisions back and forth on text? And we were like, yeah, no, I think people will. I think change adoption is wonderful and people need to get their business done. And if the easiest thing to do is to have a couple of chats about it, a text message, an instant message, whatever that tool is, we need to capture the conversations. I know this is such a shorthand, but if it's important to document what you did and know what you said, you have to make a proactive, conscious intention on how are we going to manage electronic messages. So we have issued just in January, so what great timing, 4 months ago, we issued a bulletin that expanded the capstone approach for electronic messages. We issued an update to our general records schedule that said, yep, if you're going to go capstone, here, you can use our forms. You can use the same approach and have the same disposition authority for both email and e-messages. We had, we did a webinar and slides to explain it. So if you wanted to go hear some experts at NARA talk about this in great detail, there's a link for you. And the top link is we actually created a resource, a web page. We just tried to pull all the information we had issued and shared on e-message management for agencies. So we have, I'm sorry, I'm just all of a sudden double check the questions there. John, I was on the wrong tab, so I haven't seen when the questions came in while I was talking, but I'll let you as the moderator tell me if there's anything I need to address now, or we can wait to the end. Oh, you're on mute, John.
I owe everybody $1. We'll hold the questions to the end because I just didn't want to interrupt the flow. So, and again, just a reminder, I put it in the chat, but when you get the actual presentation, all these blue things are terrific links. And so, you know, you'll really be able, it's a very rich deck in terms of moving forward. So back to you.
Yeah, I feel like when I come to a presentation like this, I like to sort of share where we are today. You can do this presentation again in 6 months. Maybe there's a new focus area, but the guidance products are really helpful because I can explain it to you, but it's always like the superpower of reading and getting a chance to look at the details. I think it's very, very helpful for folks in the information professional field, and especially for those of us involved in federal. I will not pretend that, you know, all is swimming and smooth for e-messages. The same thing when we did email back in 2016 is happening with e-messages again. We've issued guidance, we've issued requirements, we've helped issue with you know, potential disposition authority, but technically how you manage electronic messages is complicated and complex. And we know there are a lot of agencies that are coming to us talking about, well, how can I do this? What's the technical implementation? We will provide advice as best we can, but NARA is not the organization that does technology solutions, vendor solutions. That is General Services Administration. And I will say we do partner with GSA to try to help take guidance and policy and requirements and turn them into provide guidance and help and assistance with implementation. So this is, if you have questions about implementation, you can definitely send them to us. We are very interested in how electronic messages are being managed across the federal government, because if we've missed something in a guidance or policy requirement, it's always, we need to know so we can fill any gaps and provide any additional information we can. So digitization and electronic messages.
Before we leave this slide, Lisa, just to clarify for folks, when you say e-messages, are you talking about text messages, Teams messages, you know, all the above? What What's the
Yes.
definition there?
So the Federal Records Act was amended in 2014 with a definition of what covers an electronic message. And their definition was any recorded communication between individuals. So the widest definition possible. So we have clarified that when we talk about electronic messages, we do mean texts, so cell phone to cell phone texts, chats. So if you have a Teams chat or we use Google at NARA, if you're a Google chat, if you have a system in place that is specifically designed to let members of your organization send quick chats to each other versus email, covered those. Instant messages, I'm not always sure I've got the difference between an IM and a chat, but they seem to be the same type of communication. So we were like instant messaging. It even covers WhatsApp, Signal, and other messaging communications because they're designed to allow individuals to communicate with each other. They're also designed to do automatic deletion of that information immediately, which always, I appreciate why it's created. That is a problem for records management. It's a problem from the perspective of how do you know what you said and how did you document what you did if your communication disappears? So there are agencies that have just said we can't use that tool for that reason, and hopefully others as well. I'd hate for records management to be the only factor in determining what kind of messaging application to use, but it is an important factor. So yeah, it covers all electronic messages. What it does not cover is the chats that are happening right now in this meeting. We talk about electronic messages as a communication between individuals, not communication that's happening during a meeting specifically. And I hope that's a good layman's description of what we're talking about. So if you're having a conversation in a video conference, you're just using the chat feature to communicate asynchronously, where you and I are communicating synchronously at the same time. So we will have separate guidance on how to manage records that are created during on collaboration platforms. So here we all are on a video conference, collaborating, learning, talking, communicating, but we'd rather manage that as a record than say, please pull out every chat that was ever done in a video conference and manage that separately over here. No, not those. So John, I think I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Get there? Thank you. Oh, and which is a great lead into the next topic, other areas of guidance. I just wanted the community today to know that's like our two top focus areas for today, but we have other focus areas that are coming, including guidance on collaboration platforms. We've received a ton of questions about this. We've received questions even, for example, does NARA require us to record every video conference we have? Because throughout the pandemic, we saw the acceleration of the transition to electronic records, and people were able to adopt collaboration tools, start working collaboratively without having to go into an office and be in a room. So we started getting questions about what do I need to do to manage records created on collaboration platforms? The short answer to that specific question, does NARA require me to hit the record button? No, we do not. Hitting the record button is not records management. Records management is saying, how am I documenting this activity that happened? Maybe it was a video conference between two people who were just chatting using this tool. It would be a temporary or transitory record. Maybe it's the Archivist of the United States talking publicly to staff. And yeah, we would say record that because you want to have a way to share that information over time and capture what she says. So no, collaboration platforms is an area that we're focused on. I feel we have a lot of questions coming. We're going to start answering some of the big ones, and I'm sure we'll have more to talk about there as well. I also want to highlight that we have a set of requirements called the Universal Electronic Records Management Requirements. It is a spreadsheet. It is what it really is. It's just a spreadsheet, but it's a beautiful spreadsheet where our office has worked with we pulled together working groups over the different years and tried to find all of our records management requirements related to electronic records, establish the minimum set or the universal set that could apply to all electronic records, and put them in one place. So when you're trying to do electronic records management, you need to know what are NARA's requirements. You can go to that document and you can see what we said in regs, laws, bulletins, guidance, what's come from other resources that would also impact federal records management. We're about to update that and go into version 3. We've had, it's been a product that's been out there for several years, and we're currently updating it. And we're currently updating our service measures for electronic records management, which is part of the Federal Integrated Business Framework. Just so you know, we have still got our attention on, can we embed records management into systems that the government offers federal-wide? So if you have a federal offering of a vendor who's doing human resources management, travel management, grants management, could we put records management in there? So when you buy that service, you're getting records management baked in. That is the work we do with GSA and OMB on the Federal Integrated Business Framework, and we're keeping that up to date as well. So that is some other areas. And I think I wanted to just share one last piece of information on a focus area. And it exactly reflects the poll that was taken earlier. Where are you on your journey of transitioning to electronic records? How mature is your strategy? What do you have from planning to being in place? So we have one of our arms, like I said, we have 4 areas: policy, training, oversight, and doing appraisal and scheduling. I just wanted to highlight that we have just finished last month the FY22 reporting period. It was open from January to March. We do 3 data calls with that reporting period. The first is we ask agency senior agency officials for records management, your SAORMs, your assistant secretary level or equivalent positions. We ask them to give us a narrative report answering a series of questions like, are you close to meeting your transition? Do you have any questions about the strategies you're using? So those are narrative reports. And I did a double check yesterday, John. There we have 110 out of almost all SAO reports are available. We take that information, we're doing the analysis, looking for trends, looking for areas where maybe I need to write more policy because this is a theme. But I just wanted to highlight all of those reports are available on our website. So if you are interested in learning about the state of federal records management and you really enjoy detail, you can look at these reports. Some of them say, yep, we're working on it, and it's a very short paragraph. Others go into detail and they explain where they are, and it can be a really good resource for agencies who are looking for examples of what other people are doing to manage electronic records or their records management as a whole. So I just wanted you to know we also share these federal electronic records and email management reports. It's a spreadsheet again. It's a data-driven assessment of how email and electronic records are working. So we take the SAO report, we take the federal electronic records report, we take the third tool, which is not publicly available, which is why it's not linked. And then we look and say, okay, what are the trends? How are agencies progressing? And our data shows the same data that came in the poll. We know agencies are moving towards it. We know the COVID was an impact that made it difficult to make their plans for transitioning paper records, but it was an accelerator to do that to get their plans for electronic records management. So those are our areas I wanted to highlight. And then I thought, before we go to the question and answer, John, I would like to run a poll. As I have talked to you,
and before we leave this slide, I will tell everybody, if you haven't been to these reports, and it might be that I'm biased because I used to, I set up AIM's statistical program initially, in addition to being president on the side, and I love data. And if you want data, the RIMSA reports and the EMA management reports and all that stuff are terrific for getting data to kind of help explain challenges to senior management. And the SORM reports are like great anecdotal recitations of the challenges that people have. And as Lisa said, it amuses me. We were talking about this on Friday. It amuses me because there's people that I think are in some state of denial where they'll say like, everything's fine. And then there's people that will like share all their family secrets in public, and it's really interesting reading. If you haven't been there, when you get the presentation, click on these blue links. You'll really, I think, find some interesting things there.
Yeah. And it's really unusual. I've been also, so one, I have to admit, there have been times when I've done a presentation with John and he will say, so I just read 110 SARM reports. I'm waiting for the analysis from my team. I personally did not read 110 reports, but I'm going to get the summaries. So thank you. Yeah, those SAR reports are wonderful. And what's fascinating is they do give a government-wide perspective through the lens of NARA, right? Like, how do we see the federal government when we see defense, departments, agencies, not everybody's impacted by the Federal Records Act. There are legislative and congressional agencies that are not. But when you look at it, it really gives you a sense across the federal government of how are agencies doing. And it's just a wonderful resource. And it's one of the resources I use to figure out, do I have any policy gaps or challenges to focus on? So then thank you for putting this poll. I am not above saying I would love to use this workshop to find out what are future NARA priorities. These are things that I think about, worry about, like you said, it's a very exciting time. It's always been exciting in federal records management. And there's a lot of activities or items here that I'm thinking about. And I was wondering, just as a poll, if you could pick your top 3 things that you're interested in, things that you would like. I would like to have more discussion on this. And John, you can feel free to use this for a future workshop as well.
Yeah, I think talking about this would be really interesting. And I'm hoping that it looks like it is from what I'm seeing on the responses here. I hadn't ever tried the pick 3 aspect of a poll, and it looks like it's working. So that's great. And yeah, I find that to be really interesting, because usually when you deal with folks, they'll say like, all of these things are interesting. But if you force a little bit of ranked priority, it really tells you something about where people's pain points are.
Because you'll notice I have on the bottom just good old social media and federal records management. Because as we may remember, I think it was 4 months ago or 6 months ago, there was a question with Elon Musk taking over Twitter. Is Twitter going to collapse? What is this blue check? All of that, I was like, not part of my world, but I'll tell you which part was my world. Agencies were like, what do we do if our Twitter goes down and our records are lost? I was like, oh, so you didn't follow NARA's guidance that says, generally speaking, if you need to retain social media records for longer than a certain time frame, you need to pull those records into a different system. You don't use a third-party application to keep records that need to be managed for more than like a transitory record, like 30 to 60 to 90 days. So yeah, like that's just an old school one that I put on there. Websites is an old school one, but I'm like, it's still sometimes hard. And the new one, I see, this is just me. Thank you for the results. I'm fascinated by OpenAI and conversational interfaces, Chat GPT. But I see right now, only 9% of our respondents picked that. So thank you for this information. I really appreciate it. Collaboration platforms. It looks like, what's the top there, John? Collaboration platforms and cloud-based transfers to NARA. Those, I think, are 2 of the areas I know we're trying to have conversation in NARA and hopefully be able to have those conversations with agencies and externally with vendors. And I love that's on here. I'm just going to, maybe have some conversations through our Q&A. I want to use AI for records management now. I would love to be able to say, NARA, you kept, for example, a collection of email capstone officials because you collected all of it, because that was a true-false choice that was easy to implement and easy to manage. Could we now use AI on email collections and say, well, actually, this is what's worth going to the National Archives. All of this stuff over here, we don't need that. Or can we automate scheduling, appraisal, disposition? I'm just fascinated by those topics. So thank you for giving me an insight to where I should keep thinking and working. And I think, John, with that, I said, yes, there's a way to connect with us. So we have our website, our blog, we do send out emails, we do a bridge meeting every other month. That's bi-monthly, that's every other, not twice a month. And we have a lot of training materials on Facebook and Twitter. So if you want to connect with us, these are resources, they'll be in the slide deck. And I think with that, John, we should probably go on to questions.
Yes, why don't we hop in there? And before questions specifically for you, I thought a nice bridge would be there was a question from Andrea in the chat about kind of the process for digitization. And I thought, Scott, that might be a good jumping off point for you, just in terms of some practical tips about this. And then maybe, Lisa, you might also think about this. The actual question was, is there a basic workflow chart available to think about acceptable practices and approaches to this? And so why don't you start, Scott, and talk a little bit about, some practical steps and practical suggestions, and then we'll flip it over, and you might want to talk about some of the universal ARM requirements and stuff like that, Lisa, in the context of Andrew's question.
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, first of all, I really like the use of these polls on these virtual meetings. It's always interesting to get a sense for who the audience is and sort of where you are in this process. If you joined the meeting a little bit after the 11 o'clock hour, John had presented an initial poll that asked really, for those that have joined, what is your readiness? Where do you see your agency today in terms of its completion to meet the M2307 requirements? I quickly jotted down the two highest participating areas. The first one was 32% said some planning but not much implementation, and 27% said we have some departments that have made progress but not much. So if we just look at those two responses, they account for nearly 60% of all the folks on the call, which is probably a large reason as to why you decided to join the series. But if you're unfamiliar, there are a lot of different organizations that are out to help advise, act as outsource providers, consultants. Ideally, we like to think of ourselves at QAI and DocPoint as a partner to the process. But everything that we get involved in, three kind of real practical steps for us is develop a plan. And the plan, it's a combination of things, but I don't think that you're likely to perform on a budget, or for that matter, meet the expectations of a timeline without clearly defining what these expectations look like. We've been doing this for a very, very long time. And so we've had the opportunity now to repurpose a lot of these planning type documents, which has helped a number of our clients. We recommend the developing of a working committee. We find ourselves either participating on those committees as an advisor, or just general, an expert to the connecting of all these different pieces. I think the vast majority of our projects, obviously, they involve a lot of history, change, institutional knowledge, and certainly expectation. We see the value in bringing, records managers, IT, facility folks, all these people's perspective, getting involved in the helping of what this plan might look like. And the last thing is developing a budget. There are great expectations by a lot of the clients that we work with. Sometimes these projects never, quite come out of the departmental scope, because there's really not an enterprise or agency-wide budget that has been considered to take on what really needs to be done. So I would say these projects are in a lot of cases complex, lots of moving parts, a lot of folks that are generally involved, and not something you probably want to go at alone. Find some folks that are doing this on a regular basis and can help to give you feedback on where to be. So thanks, John, for that little quick few-minute feedback.
Great. Lisa, did you want to chime in on that question about kind of the workflow for, how people ought to go about this in sort of a reasonable way? You're on mute. You owe me $1.
Yes, I know. We're going to get into coffee money here pretty soon. So yes, I will share this. We the digitization regs, which I'm so excited to be coming out in a few weeks, were written from a workflow perspective. So we published those regs in 2020. Yep, 3 years ago, we had a draft version that we put on the Federal Register for agency and public comment. One of the comments we got back was, I can't quite see the workflow. Like you're putting different pieces in different places. So one of our changes was we established sort of a workflow through the regs themselves. Step one, what's your scope? Okay, so there's like a scope piece. But step two was wait, before you do records digitization, do records management. Do you know what your collection is? What type of media, like what's your paper? Like if we're doing paper, like you got onion skin, fax thermal, or is it modern office paper? These records are only 20 years old. Do you have gaps in the records? Because it was a digitization problem. If you all of a sudden you're like, what happened to 2020 records? COVID's what happened. We didn't produce any records that year, right? So you have to sort of know records management. Then we make you do documentation. I'm literally giving you the workflow. Sorry about that, but I'm excited. So you're like, okay, now you scope your project. I know I've done the documentation. I know what vendors I'm using, what scope I'm using. I know what quality I'm planning. And then our regs will move into technical things. Like, okay, well, what are the technical requirements? What is the quality management? Because you have to do quality management during digitization. Can't do it on the back end, and you sure can't do it easily, 10 years later. So we have a technical piece, a quality piece, a whole piece on metadata, because metadata is important. Some of it you got from records management, some of metadata you get through your documentation, and some metadata you get through digitization processes themselves. So a metadata section, and then the workflow will end with validation. Validation is not the same as quality management. Quality management makes sure the records that I'm digitizing, they're readable, legible. I've checked every day. I've checked a sample. I've checked a batch. Validation is, did you do quality every day? Did you cover all these steps? Are you sure these records are able to serve the same purpose as the source records? So that's our workflow that's set up in the regs, and we will be producing more guidance products. And that is a great suggestion. So maybe I'll come back and we'll see if we can't do a high-level workflow chart on that. So thank you. Yeah, come back to the next the QAI presentation that Kevin and Jeff will do. They're both experts in digitization and will probably have that guidance and drop a link.
Yeah, do you want to talk, you've talked about this in the past, which I think is really interesting. When you think about those digitization standards, and so having those standards is one thing, or having those regulations, I guess more accurate, is one thing. How you operationalize those in a scale environment, I think ultimately becomes the key to their effectiveness. And I know you've talked, but maybe just talk a little bit about how important that step will be and what happens after they're issued.
That is what is going to happen after you issue them. Yeah, I keep on smiling because we've worked so hard to get these digitization standards, which we put in regulation. And it's, we've been working so diligently answering questions. And I would say, I think we've thought through so many issues. You may not like the answer to a question, but we thought through the answer to a question. But that was just to get to the point of now you've issued them. Now agencies have to implement them. Their implementation is, first of all, it got broken into two things. One question is, what about everything I've already digitized? What about permanent records that I've already digitized? And we're going to have separate guidance coming on that. The next question is, okay, I'm going to pivot. I'm going to go forward. I'm going to use these requirements and put them in records management contracts. The hard part, John, is we had to write regulations that cover the digitization of permanent records. Whether you have 100,000 boxes, you're at an EPA, and I'll use them as an example of EP level of digitization, or I am a small agency and I have 10 cubic feet of permanent records. So where am I going to go? What path? There's going to be so many different ways to implement, and we're going to try to provide some best practices and guidance and share resources on how to do that implementation. We're also going to work with GSA. So for those of you who are in the records management space, I mentioned a little earlier, we have this federal integrated business framework. We work with GSA. We give GSA the requirements because NARA is the electronic records management standards lead for the federal government. So we can speak with authority and say, this is what must be done. Then GSA can take those requirements and work with vendors to create vendors that have self-certified, I can meet these requirements. So part of that implementation will be agencies going, should I do this myself? Should I try to like do this in-house, or should I go to a vendor service? It is a skill to digitize records. I will say, I didn't mention this part, document prep. That is a giant part of the machine can suck and scan what, hundreds, thousands of documents, per hour and give you wonderful output. That doesn't mean you're not going to need to have people who know how to do doc prep. What do you do when you find like it just takes so much time? And then are you going to have to reassemble on the back end? And I think many agencies would say, yes, we do need to reassemble those. My layman's term is, are you really going to go scanner to shredder? It's cost effective. Or do you need to say, no, I'm going to need to reassemble on the back end, make sure I've maintained all that order, because I'm going to use the electronic records now, the digitized records for my business, but I want to keep the originals for a certain matter of time in case there's a risk and I need to go back and say, yep, I still have the source records. So
yeah, the part that really
that's the answer. The implementation, there's so many decisions to make, and we'll provide guidance we can as best we can. One size, not at all.
The part that fascinates me about that, and Scott, I don't know if you have a take on this, being in the suck and scan business, as Lisa described it, is that okay, in an operational environment, even though somewhere 3, 5, 7, whatever % of records are actually permanent in kind of a NARA context,
Yes.
You've got sort of these. You scan these documents, and if you have one set of requirements for what are theoretically temporary records and another for permanent records, are you going to have separate scans for that? Or are you going to have one cycle? Like, my personal thought is that what's going to happen is that the permanent requirements will bleed down into the temporary requirements, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but maybe, Scott, you've spent a little time thinking about the complexity of this, and it's not to mention, equipment that you already have installed in places, and how do you make sure that that's compliant?
I think something that's really not realistic for an organization to take on is what some of these testing platforms need to look like. So a few things that were just mentioned by Lisa and yourself too, John. We opened a digital innovation center really to get aligned with NARA and these future coming final guidelines that are expected. We've challenged the hardware folks, we've challenged the software folks. A lot of what is in market today, we were able to produce adequate results, but more in a one-off type environment. And so that comment around how do we operationalize all of this into a much larger scale so that we can provide and perform these services cost effectively at large scale. And so we've been doing this for the past several years. We literally launched a new facility. We've brought lots of different people from industry into our sites to work with our technical folks to really hone in on the skill to move from what would be done in a proof of concept pilot mode and what it ultimately might look like at full production scale. So I know how long it's taken us. I know what amount of time and effort and really a lot of fun that we've had getting through all this. But it's just, to me, not an effort that would make a lot of sense for somebody to bring in-house. And I think if there are outlets for you to get advice, or if there are sites for you to go and see, this is a very visual thing. Take advantage of that sort of thing, right? If there's centers or facilities or groups that are saying they can do this and your choice is to outsource, go take a look and see what it is that they're actually doing. I know in our case, we get a lot of visitors who are preparing themselves for what all these next steps might look like, and then still straddling with the idea of, well, will this be something we do in-house? Will it be something that we choose to outsource, or will this end up being kind of a hybrid approach? So lots of things, right, going on. And I think as those guidelines get closer to that final state, you're going to see a lot of people ready to move. And so what does that movement look like? Just some of my feedback from our lens, here in the private sector world.
We have just a couple minutes left, and we'll get back to everybody when I think we're getting a lot of great questions here. One cluster of questions just quickly, Lisa, and my layman's answer would be yes, and then but you could be probably a little bit more precise. Cluster of questions about the cloud and whether things are created in the cloud or stored in the cloud, and whether all this applies to those kinds of records.
Yes, I like your answer. We've got a few minutes left. We'll go with yes. So cloud-based records management is wonderful, right? Because there have been horror stories over years of, oh, I had my records stored on a laptop and I lost it. Oh, well, now you have an unauthorized disposal of records. So the idea, again, of trying to remove records management responsibilities from individuals means cloud-based storage of electronic records is a desirable path forward. So it doesn't matter if it was created on an agency cloud, contracted cloud, how you uploaded information to the cloud, but where records are stored should not impact the requirements on how to manage those records. Hopefully, it just makes it easier. So, so I'll just give you high level. Yes.
Yeah.
Born digital records and digitized records both have to be managed.
Quick question from Judy about any plans to expand metadata requirements. They're basically minimum metadata requirements because, they're obviously making some plans.
Yes, the digitization regulations. This is something that's, this is a little behind the scenes. I thought that metadata should stay outside of the digitization regs because I thought it doesn't matter. When you have metadata for electronic records, why do you care if it was born digital or digitized? I only wanted to see the technical metadata that's produced through digitization in the guidance. That's not how it ended up. Various yada, yada, yada sausage making regulations, voila. The digitization regs are going to contain minimum metadata, and they've updated to align that metadata to map to NARA's requirements and needs. So yes, there's a plan to update. It's coming out in 3 or 4 weeks. My hope and my plan is to try to create a one-stop shop. I haven't done this yet, but it's my plan. A one-stop shop of NARA resource where you can find all of our metadata requirements related to different types of messages. So you would have a minimum set of metadata that's describing records. NARA needs that. And I know it's crazy. Like one of our metadata elements is we need to know the organizational name of the agency that created it. And I sometimes smile because I could hear people being like, well, isn't my email agency name evident in my email? I'm Lisa Haralampus at NARA.gov. So why do you need to know agency name? And I'm like, well, believe it or not, 20 years from now, I might not be called NARA.gov. We live in the future and in the past. We're not in the present. So we need to know what happened then and what's going to happen in the future. So yeah, we have a lot of descriptive metadata, administrative metadata. I want to pull together metadata for file formats. Yeah, and thank you for just saying like a one-stop shop. Could I comb through all the policy that we know and put it there? And we are also putting that in the universal ERM requirements. So I have the minimum that's required, but a one-stop shop could also talk about, oh, well, this is specific to, text records, e-messages. You always want to know your number, the date. You've got a limited character, and is there a link? Like, do we want specific metadata on those pieces? Metadata is an ongoing issue. We'll never not be working on metadata.
So I'm going to ask you in a second. We're just about out of time. We have some questions we'll answer offline, and I really appreciate them. I also especially appreciate the people that have teed up some ideas for future sessions, which is terrific. I'll ask you in a second, Lisa, for one parting thought for everybody. But again, this is the schedule in the next few months. We're going to continue these. We might populate this with some other ones inserted in between here too. So we hope you'll join us for future versions of this. And if you have any questions that you'd like to raise, send them to me at jmancini77@gmail. And if you have any questions, practical questions about your own strategies that you'd like to raise with somebody offline, please don't hesitate to contact either me or the QAI people, and I'm sure they'd be happy to answer it. So I'll put you on spot, Lisa. One parting thought before we wrap this up.
Records management is the best challenge you're ever going to get to work on. Those people who come into this profession from AIM or ARMA or federal records management, the goal of this project is fascinating. And thank you for everybody who's on this conference who's got some role they play somewhere in federal information records management, data management, all of it. Because at the end of the day, we're doing this work for the American public. And we at the National Archives are honored that we're able to save that history and take your records that you've created and preserve them and make them available for the future. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for the challenges you're figuring out.
Thank you, everybody. Scott, thank you. Lisa, thank you. Great session. Really enjoyed it. And please don't hesitate to share the recording and the slides with your colleagues. And again, look for Lisa's blue links. They're really good. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.